With all the tensions in the global economic system these days, what can countries do to protect themselves?
What they should be trying to do is not to reject trade. They will want to diversify their exposures, simply try to expand their trade relationships. As you diversify, you become more resilient.
Michele Ruta is a division chief and an expert on trade and global imbalances here at the IMF. He's also a co-author of Trade Cooperation in an Age of Geopolitics, which was published in the June edition of Finance and Development magazine. All right, welcome to the podcast once again. So this latest piece that you have written in Finance and Development magazine is all about the changing nature of trade amid all this geopolitical turmoil. But hasn't trade always been caught up in geopolitics? What's different this time?
So thanks, Bruce, for having me again. First of all, let me acknowledge my two co-authors.
Sure.
It's Aditya Mathur, who is currently the Director of Research at the World Bank, and Bob Steiger, who is the current Chief Economist at the WTO. These are two great experts on the economics of the trading system. So really two great co-authors, and I learned so much from them. And I think what we write in there and what I'm going to talk about is mostly the result of 2 years of conversations with them.
Wow, good.
So let me start with what is not different, what's the same.
Okay.
So geopolitics and trade policy have been linked for many, many years. So if you go back to ancient Rome, the Romans used to have export controls of weapons and iron, especially to the barbarians outside of the frontiers. They had what we now call managed trade for grains coming from Egypt, just making sure that it was channeled to Rome and not to other places.
How interesting.
Now you go to more recent times, the Europeans, 1700s, 1800s, there were all these rivalries among different countries, France, the Netherlands, Great Britain, etc. And they would use trade policy all the time for geopolitical purposes. So one example is Napoleon that did the continental system. He basically tried to ban trade with Britain, not only for France, but also for the countries that were under the influence of France. And again, the goal was a geopolitical goal, to weaken a rival.
Okay.
So if you see it from this point of view, the export controls of semiconductors or critical minerals or the tariffs that we see today may look very, very familiar.
Yeah.
Now, there are also reasons why, though, the situation today is very different, at least from the past 80 years. The first is that the rivals of today, I would say the self-declared rivals of today, are the United States and China. Those are the two superpowers. But they are very integrated in terms of trade. So this is very different if, for instance, you compare it with the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Those were two economies that traded very little with each other. The second reason why it is very different is if you go back to the 1947, this is the founding moment of the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. And this basically was a creation of the United States, which complement the Bretton Woods institutions, the institutions we work for. And there were two ideas behind this. One is that we needed rules. And the rules were really to facilitate the negotiations on tariffs among the members. During World War II, the tariffs have been going up very rapidly, and they needed to go down for economic efficiency reasons. And so the rules of non-discrimination, reciprocity, would serve the purpose of facilitating these negotiations.
Those rules that we've seemed to have forgotten at this point.
That's I'm getting to that. But then the second reason why the U.S. Pushed in that direction is that the U.S. at that point was the sole superpower. political scientists would say that the US was the hegemon at the time. Yeah. And it had a goal to induce participation into this system by other countries. And to induce participation, it decided to commit itself to rules that de facto would limit its own power. And because it limited its own power, others understood that the system was a system worth engaging into because they would be protected against future possible abuses by a hegemon. So there was a lot of enlightened self-interest that was very, very important, and one reason why the rule system was created.
So trade, I mean, this system that you just described there is essentially based on the assumption or the premise that trade is always beneficial. I mean, that premise is being put to the test right now. But, why would a country choose to not trade with another country when the benefits are so obvious?
So this goes to the heart of the issue and also to the heart of what we discussed about in F&D. Mm-hmm. So economists generally assume that when a government chooses a policy, in this case a trade policy, it does so to maximize social welfare. So if a policy leads to lower prices, to more varieties coming from other countries, to more ideas floating, higher innovation and growth, then there is an incentive to adopt that policy. Yeah. Now, when you think about in geopolitical terms, and that's a lesson that we learn from political scientists, the situation may be different. Because in geopolitical terms, you care about power, and power often is viewed as a relative concept, not an absolute concept. So in other words, if you have a geopolitical goal, you do not only care about what a policy, trade policy, does to yourself, to your country, and to your citizens, but you may also care what it does to the other country. Mm-hmm. And there are situations where you say, well, this policy may hurt my country a bit, but it also has a negative effect on the other country, which I may value. And that's why they can get implemented. So let me give you a concrete example, semiconductors. It is a different situation if the goal of the government choosing a policy is not only to promote the production of semiconductors in its own country, but also to make sure that the other country stays a little bit behind on that strategic product. If that's the goal, then suddenly trade policy can become a strategic tool, and it might make sense to reduce exports of certain inputs that go into the production of semiconductors or limit the technology transfer that is used for the technologies that are used to produce semiconductors. So you see immediately governments switch from I just need to have a policy to maximize my welfare, or I need to have a policy to make sure that I do better than the other.
So, if the motivations for trade are, not economics, but geopolitical gain, ultimately it's the consumers that pay the price, no?
Definitely. So the consumers would end up paying the prices through, for instance, higher prices, literally, mm-hmm. or because they have less choice. Governments still may have reasons why they want to do this, exactly because the measure not only hurt their own consumers, but they may have consequences for the other countries that they may value mm-hmm. for some reason.
So you also talk a lot about cooperation and the benefits of cooperation. But if countries are political rivals and trade is affected, what does cooperation in those terms look like?
So this is one of the findings that we have in our research that I think people find most surprising. Mm-hmm. Now, we tend to think that if, Bruce, you and I are rivals,
yeah.
then we would have little incentive to cooperate. Because if I cooperate, that might help you, and I don't want that.
Unless we have a common enemy.
Unless a common enemy, but that will keep it outside for now. Now, In practice, it is not so extreme. And it's not so extreme exactly for the reason that we just highlighted, that trade policy measures, even when they have a strategic objective, they may still hurt efficiency, they may still hurt social welfare. And governments still care about that, even when they are acting geopolitically and they may have a specific goal, promote semiconductor or whatever, they would still care about social welfare. So if they do care at least a little bit about the social welfare part, then there is an argument for cooperation, trade cooperation. And that's what you see in practice. So what is wrong, I think, in the intuition that many people have that rivalry would need inevitably to no form of cooperation is because they go to the extreme where governments only care about dominance, they only care about pushing down the rival. In practice, that's not the case. For some sectors, maybe that's a very important component, but then they do care about the gains from trade that can come from trading in other areas, and this still requires cooperation. So cooperation is still something that even governments with geopolitical objectives may want to do, as long as they have, to some extent, enlightened self-interest.
So you've written this piece, and I think one of the reasons why it's so relevant is that there's a lot of people out there that think that the system is not working the way that it should. And in your research, you suggest that you might have something that could help the current system be more effective, called the geopolitical exemption. So how would that work?
So let me give you a little bit of background. I already mentioned 1947, the beginning of the GATT, the fact that tariffs had gone up during the 30s and then World War II. At that point, when these rules of the GATT were created, the goal was to allow countries to negotiate trade protectionism down. That's how they were designed, and they were pretty successful to achieve that. Now, the situation is quite different from back then, because we have this geopolitical rivalry between the US and China. But as we said at the beginning, these are highly integrated countries. The trade barriers, in part, are still there, of course. In part, obviously, went up in 2025. But the trade that has been created between these two countries and the flows between these two countries is very, very large. And so the question that we were asking ourselves is, do the rules back in 1947, which are great from many points of view, do they help in addressing this specific problem? And the answer that we are giving is that probably not. And let me explain why. The two main rules, the pillars of this system, of the trading system, are non-discrimination and reciprocity. Now, when you have two countries, the US and China, that have become very integrated, and they need to find a new equilibrium because there is this geopolitical shock that has happened somewhere in the middle, they probably need to find some kind of bilateral deal. A bilateral deal is by nature a discriminatory deal because it involves only two, and may not be reciprocal. One country may gain more than the other. So in some sense, the rules that there are now, because they were designed to address a different problem, are not really setting these two countries up for success.
Right. So you suggest in this research that there are existing areas where they address some of the issues that seem dysfunctional these days, and those are in the free trade areas that are designed for, specific things. If those free trade areas are good at addressing some of these issues that you're talking about, why can we not just sort of apply the free trade area thinking, just implemented on a global scale?
So the GATT and the World Trade Organization, that system of rules that govern multilateral trade have many flexibilities, which is actually a good thing. But most of these flexibilities have to do with situations where countries face some pressure to impose protectionist measures.
Yeah.
And they work essentially as safety valves. They make sense because it keeps the system together. Other exceptions and the free trade areas that you talked about is essentially for countries that want to get closer to each other. They want to trade more. They want to go ahead relative to all other partners. And what the systems allow to do is just, okay, you can discriminate if you go ahead as long as you don't have negative effects on other countries.
For third parties.
Yeah, that's what the rules essentially are there for. Now, these types of flexibilities are not really helpful here because essentially you have two countries that are integrated and they sort of want to disengage. That's what they are trying to do. They're trying to reduce their dependence, at least in certain sectors. And so the problem is different. So it's not about getting closer together or have a temporary safety valve. It's about disengaging from each other in a way that makes sense to them. And the point that we add, and that's the idea of the geopolitical exemption, is that they should do it in a controlled way so that whatever new agreement they find has the minimal spillover effects on other countries. And that, I think, is the main problem. Now, let me also say that obviously this is not what may happen anyways. You know, US and China may end up not cooperating. And that's another possibility that we look at in our research. What may happen is that they go into what we call a trade war and redemption path. They simply start imposing restrictions on each other. And for sure, 2025 gave the impression that they were moving in that direction. Yeah. And as they do that, they will reduce naturally their bilateral trade, and they could reduce it up to a point where it goes very low, and it really has a negative effect on the welfare of both countries. It can also have spillover effects on other countries. And at that point, you know, somebody will say, well, this situation is not efficient for us, and they may start negotiating again. Now, that's another possibility that could happen. The only thing that we would say is that it does not take that long to go down the path of disengagement. It generally takes very long to go up the path of re-engagement. As I said, for the GATT, it took 50 years to bring tariffs down. So it's an alternative path, but it can be very painful.
So how do we, implement some of the things that you're talking about, including those, the geopolitical exemption, for example? How do we implement that? And what does international trade look like if that doesn't happen?
So let me say more what can go right. I think it's what can go wrong. I think it's more this idea that either we have a full-fledged trade war or we have a bilateral agreement that is mostly about managed trade and can hurt third countries. Now, there can be a positive scenario. In our view, the positive scenario is one where there is a deal between the US and China, and this is done through a geopolitical exceptions or some other tool that essentially allows to minimize the consequences for third countries. Now, in the past, the trade system has adapted to many different kinds of shocks, and it has changed quite a bit. There was no services agreement in 1947, and then we got a services agreement. There were no rules on intellectual property rights, and then we got rules of intellectual property rights. So the system is sufficiently flexible. It can introduce new forms of flexibility that would somehow also control the spillover effects on third countries.
Yeah.
Now, an important requirement, I think, is that both the US and China remember the lesson from 1947. And the lesson from 1947 is that rules are important, and they are also important because it's what they allow others to join into the system and fully participate. So that's the enlightened self-interest is what is really needed at this stage.
Michele Ruta is a division chief in the IMF's Strategy, Policy and Review Department. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bruce.
Look for Trade Cooperation in an Age of Geopolitics in the June issue of Finance and Development magazine, which, by the way, is all about geoeconomics. Go to imf.org/FND. And look for other IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen. You can also follow us on X. Our handle is @IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.